Okay, I think it looks like we're recording.
Looks like we're recording.
Yay! So, hi everyone. I'm Stephanie Quick. Happy Friday the 13th. Today, I am joined by Dr. C.S. Matthews, also known as WHAM, and we're going to be talking today. I asked her to join me because we started having a conversation on Facebook that she initiated, talking about sex and its role in facilitating all these kind of exotic and altered states of consciousness. Her journey looking at finding that the erotic in relationship to the divine or the all that is for her primary kind of behind the sex drive, and how this relates to her own spiritual practice. And of course, this is the type of thing that I'm always very interested in, and practices related to that. So Wham very graciously agreed to join me. I'm going to introduce her a little bit. First, I guess the main thing to know about Dr. Matthews is that she's super brainy and educated. She has degrees in religious studies and American cultural studies, and she teaches at college. She has studied paranormal reports and experiences for about 4 decades now, including from the academic angle, which is very valuable. She is a journalist. She's published poetry, very creative, a textbook on new religious movements, which I think some of you might be interested in. Recently, she has written a book called Mysterious Beauty, Living with the Paranormal in the Hudson Valley. And if you're interested in WHAM, Dr. Matthews, that's a great point to start, and I really like it. It's kind of like a holistic approach to the paranormal, where you're looking at a place through time, bringing certain theoretical models to bear on this place, and then seeing how these experiences unfold in the lives of various researchers and experiencers. She profiles several people who have been living in the Hudson Valley for a number of years and researching and experiencing there from different angles. So I think it's very valuable. It's an approach that's becoming more popular and well known in the paranormal. So I would suggest that if you can't buy her book right away, which I would suggest is very much worth it. If you like an introduction to that, you can, she's done a couple of interviews, which are great, with Fahrusha on Shattered Reality podcast, which I completely endorse, and also with Alexx Bollen on the Alexx cast. And that was a really fun interview because Alexx grew up in the same area, and he's also written a number of books that take place in that area. I don't have it here. His novel Periphery takes place in that part of New York, and it's very much about a lot of his work about what we're going to be talking today about, the whole kind of the idea of the alchemical wedding and integrating the self, and those type of mystical, erotic themes, as it were. So let's see, the only other thing I wanted to say, and one of the reasons that I was so happy that you agreed to speak with me today, Wham, is I always think of it as the trifecta, but it's actually kind of 4 things that the people that really get me going about approaching the paranormal, esoteric, these kind of strange part of life, is if you have some type of rigorous academic training and background, if you've spent time researching, like in the field or through texts, people that have had spontaneous experiences of the paranormal, and then also people who have done some type of esoteric or meditative spiritual practice through time.
All me. I've done all those.
And there's of course, I think the classic person that everyone loves about this is, of course, Dr. Jacques Vallée, is, ticks all those boxes as well. Also, a lot of these people tend to be, as are you, very creative and writing. Vallée, he's written novels, you've written poetry and stuff. But I find that type of having these various models that you can kind of bring to bear to kind of cross-check or kind of see, I find very valuable. So anyway, is there anything you would like to say at this point? Because I sent you a whole bunch of big questions, which, you want to say is fine.
Well, no, I mean, when I looked at your questions, I mean, this is what I'll say. When I looked at your questions, I thought to myself, first of all, I thought to myself, well, each one of these questions will take a lifetime to figure out.
Exactly.
But I also thought to myself, you know, I felt like something was missing for me out of the questions, the way that you wrote them. And that's not to put you down at all in any way. Um, and so I had to sort of go back and think about myself with regard to them. And I realized that for me, what the missing element was love. And I'm not talking about romantic love here. I'm talking about that deep kind of creaturely love that it, to me, in my experience, is really the source of life and the source of my own being. And and it's not actually a sentimental love, because love is capable of all kinds of things. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
even Crowley puts it at the center of his maxim. And so even though then he tries to divide it from will, which it is actually not divided from will at all.
I would agree. I would agree.
But that's because of who he was and what and the way he was raised and what his goals were. So I thought about it a long time, and I thought, do you want to ask a question, or do you want me to tell you a little story first about where
Oh,
I'm coming
tell a
from?
story.
Okay. This is a story, and I'm going to tell it sort of in the third person,
Mhm.
because that's the way my memories go.
Okay.
But it's the story of a little girl who, when she was 4 years old, she discovered her father's secret. And her father was a very religious man, very rigid in his religiosity in a lot of ways. But he was not without his passions and his loves. He was just really rigid.
Mhm.
And she came to find out why later on. But she discovered his secret at the age of 4. She noticed that he kept going into this room in the house that was unused. And so at some point, because I guess it didn't occur to him to lock the door, at some point she went in there. And
Mhm.
what she found was that he had a big stash of, I guess, what we would now call pornography. She didn't
Mhm.
know what it was. It was just a big stash of magazines on the
Yeah.
floor. And it just so happened that while she was in there, he caught her. He caught her in the room.
Yeah.
And, without going into a lot of detail, what his response to her finding the stash was to sexually assault her.
Ugh, what a
That was his
sweetheart.
that was his response. And I don't want to go into the details of that for a
No,
variety
that's
of reasons.
perfectly fine.
I mean, but in the process of that assault, there were two things that happened. The first is that her psyche was shattered. It was completely shattered. And but in the process of that shattering, there was a part of her that reached out and latched onto the only thing that she could see. It was like right in front of her. And what was right in front of her, hanging, because this room was actually an unused bathroom. Okay, so it had
Mhm.
like a bathtub and a toilet and all this stuff, but the plumbing was off, so it wasn't used. But off of the faucet of the bathtub, there was a shed spider skin that
Mhm.
was hanging there, and she fixated on that, and that was sort of like that was the memory of that moment that she most clearly carried about what had happened for a really long time. Now,
Yes.
fast forward a couple of years or so, still in the same house, still in the same house. She was coming in from the outside, I think from church, actually. She hated church. That's a phone. Ignore the phone. It's for my partner, and it's has nothing to do with me. Um, But she was coming up the stairs, and from a porch, there was like an enclosed porch. And as she came up the stairs holding the rails, she probably grabbed it from underneath. She doesn't really remember, but there was a shed spider skin that brushed
Yes.
her hand, and her body reacted just like just like that, because what she now knows is that there was that memory being triggered, but she didn't consciously remember it in her brain. Her body remembered, but her
Yes.
brain didn't remember. But what her brain said was, and this is extraordinary, what her brain said was, I'm obviously talking about myself. I remember this clearly.
Hmm.
She said, "Why am I so afraid of that spider? Should I be afraid of spiders?" And thus she started this whole investigation at that time in her life, at the age of 6 or 7, about
Hmm.
whether or not she should be afraid of spiders. And she had her mother get spider books from the library, and she read
Hmm.
about spiders, and she realized that spiders are totally cool.
They are.
They're totally cool. And just because they look kind of spiky and weird doesn't mean they're not totally cool. And so thus began her quest for knowledge.
Can I
Okay.
ask you a question? What
Sure.
do you recall if this insight with this second spider shed? Do you recall if it was before or after that UFO experience that you had?
That I don't recall.
Yeah, yeah.
That I don't, but it would have, but based on what I've been able to sort of kind of read back, it
Hmm.
would have been within the same year.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I don't know when it was in there, because that year from 1966 to 1977, between the ages of 5 and 6, were
Hmm.
really significant, because there were three events that occurred that all really shaped my sense of fear. And
Hmm.
one was this, what I just described to you. The other was the UFO experience,
Yes.
which you've probably heard me tell the story of,
Yeah.
and that was um, important, because it was really the first time that I had a sense of myself as a separate being.
Uh-huh.
And it certainly triggered my intellectual capacity. And then the third event was also the year that a very large and destructive tornado hit Topeka, Kansas.
Yeah.
And in fact, it turns out that historically that was a really important tornado. But what happened was, my parents were visiting my grandparents that summer,
Hmm.
and they only lived like 30 miles outside of where this tornado hit. And my grandmother had a sister who was in the
Oh,
tornado. She survived it. She survived it. She was on the right side of it, so that she actually ended up taking in refugees into her apartment.
wow.
From
Yeah.
but we drove through the aftermath, like maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and it was like that one of the first times that like an F5 tornado had plowed right through a major city.
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
And it scared the crap out of me. Just, I can remember sitting in the car and looking around and going, it was like a bomb went off. It was just incredible. But only I think it was only 14 people were killed in that, and that was because it was the very first time in
Hmm.
history that an entire alarm system had been used.
Oh, wow.
And so
Yeah.
it's the first time it had ever been deployed, and it worked.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I'm not done with the spider yet.
No,
Okay.
please
because
continue, please.
because the spider becomes very important later on, because I go through, this young person goes through her life, and she ends up having a lot of issues because of how she was raised. The whole issue with pornography and my father did not end. I mean, it goes on and on. I can tell, and I can also talk about all kinds of weird paranormal things that happened at home, and with my father, that had to do with sex and weirdness and whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, when this person was 21 they had just turned 21, turned 21 years old, um, and had managed to keep herself out of the mental hospital. She had actually been put in the mental hospital once, but had managed to keep herself from being put in it again.
Yep.
And was trying to get off of alcohol, and she was really screwed up. She ended up having this tumultuous, crazy infatuation with her sponsor in AA,
Oh
which
boy.
is pretty normal. Okay.
Yeah.
And pretty normal. And this sponsor, who was a woman, was actually really good about handling it, because it's pretty normal.
Yeah.
But what ended up happening was, you know, this person had a lot. She had a lot to deal with, and so she was living at home with her mother, and she, let's see, how's the quick way to put it? The quick way to put it is that she had convinced her mother, because of her thing with spiders, she had convinced her mother not to kill this large orb weaver spider that lived right outside on the front porch. It was sort of to the side as you walked out. And she was beautiful. She was like one of those big golden ones, that make the big, huge orb. And she would like make it every single morning, and then every single evening she'd make it, and then every morning she would take it down. And I found out later that they can do that really fast, because they know what the guidelines are, and all you do is pull the guidelines and the whole thing draws up. They're really astonishing people. But anyway, so she had been living there for about 6 weeks, and it was to the point where my mom and I would both greet her as we come in and out. Hi, and she'd just sit there and she'd catch her bugs, and whatever. So I'd convinced my mom that if the spiders were outside, that you could leave them alone. Okay. So anyway, I was having this terrible heartbreak over this person. And I mean, seriously, and I knew that it was screwed up. I knew that I was screwed up. I knew that something needed to change, but I didn't know what. And I'd had a number of spiritual experiences in my life, but I didn't know what to do. And so I walked outside one evening. I had cried and cried and cried and cried. I was completely drained. And I walked outside and said hi to the spider, because I had forgotten some stuff in my car. And I walked out to my car and I looked up into the sky, and I just saw there was no moon that night. So it was just the Milky Way. This is in Kansas. So you can actually, at that time, you actually had no light pollution. So you could actually see the sky. So I could see the sky. And I just sort of opened myself up. I just said, to the universe, to whatever, I don't know what to do. I'm fucked up. I just don't know what to do. And all of a sudden, this light came through the top of my head, down through me, and exited my back. And I was aware of this immense universal presence. And it was female. And it was appearing to me as a giant spider.
Yeah.
Like a giant, and actually it had a specific form, which I now know is a specific form. It wasn't years later till I found out what that specific form was. And I got a message, and the message was, okay, get your stuff, go out there and go back in and sit down. And what's important to note is that when I had walked out of the house and said hello to the spider, she was building her web. She was only about a quarter done. Okay. And her web is so big, it took a while for her to build it. She was only about a quarter done when I had first walked out. By the time I gathered my stuff together and walked back in, I looked at her. I didn't think of this at the time, and she was completely done. So I had lost time already out there. And she was like hanging in there, just hanging in there. And so I walked in and I sat down, and I was supposed to get a piece of paper and a pencil, which I did. And I lost 2 hours. I don't really remember what happened in those 2 hours, except that I was encased in this orange light and I was being reprogrammed. I felt like what it felt like was that my head was open, and
Mhm.
there was just stuff being taken out and stuff being taken. That's just how it felt. But it was not, didn't hurt. And I had no sense of time. And when I came out of it, I had written a poem, which I
Mhm.
didn't call writing.
Mhm.
I'd written a poem, and the next morning, I just set it down and went to bed. And then the next morning, I woke up and the melody came to the poem,
Mhm.
and I had a song. And it's like my spirit song.
Yes.
And
Yes.
when I read the poem, I said to myself, if I never do another thing in the world, this poem is me. This song is me.
Mhm.
And so that happened, and everything was different after that. Now, of course, a lot of things have happened since then, and it wasn't until 2 years ago,
Mhm.
literally in my life, 2 years ago, that I was doing a meditation. And see, I had always remembered components of the original sexual assault memory. I had always
Yes.
remembered components of it, but it never come together because in the process of shattering, I had disassociated from the emotional part of it. So the
Yes.
emotional part is way over here somewhere. And I was meditating on something else. I was trying to follow my thoughts about a certain issue in my life, and
Mhm.
I was just following them, and all of a sudden the entire emotional content of that experience just went boop, and I was right there and relived the whole thing, which I had never done before. And but the important thing was that I had friends and I had the ability to see how that was connected to spider.
Yes.
Because what's important about this, and why this has to do with your questions about the erotic, is
Yes.
that is that there was a part of that child that found a way to survive that experience. And that way to survive that experience. What is that?
Hmm?
Do you hear a noise? I'm just
Yeah. I don't know what it is.
oh, okay. Oh, there. See, oh, somebody. Oh, there it is. Okay, I see what it is.
What
Okay,
is it?
I
Okay.
it was just something else. Okay, it was
Okay.
because I was talking and someone was annoyed. Anyway, uh, people don't like us to talk about these things. Anyway,
Yeah.
um, the because that child sent out a feeler that helped her survive. And that feeler was the part of her that would help tether that emotional shattering and be able to bring all of that emotionally forward to the time and the place where she would be able to have the emotional ballast to be able to integrate that.
Yes.
And I believe that's because all time is simultaneous. And on some level, my soul knew that that would happen.
Yes.
You see, so the person that I am is rooted in that person who is rooted in that child that was able to find a way of saving her, both her intuitional, emotional, and intellectual stuff together. So to me, when some people talk about the sexual part of it, the
Mhm.
way I experience that is actually just simply an integration of my intuitional and intellectual self. Because in our society, we have separated those components from each other,
Yes.
and identified one as masculine and one as feminine. And in my own life, that's just bullshit. It's not who I am. I'm a person. We're all people.
Exactly. Yes.
I mean, I guess some people express that by saying the divine androgen. It's like, to me, it's even more than that. You know what I mean? It's like even more integrated than that. I'm a soul first. And the other thing that child did in doing that was that she, in encountering the spider, she figured out that spiders are living beings. They're living creatures that we have decided, because they look kind of weird and icky, and we don't understand them, and we think they're kind of creepy. And because they're obligate predators, which we don't like
Yes.
to remember that we are predators. We don't like to remember that there's this part of us that's like that. So we project a lot of our fears and our darkness on them. And
Mhm.
they are really highly intelligent, very aware, very sensitive beings. And the spirit behind them is incredibly embracing, and actually is one of the entities that helps to keep all the worlds together. So is incredibly important. And so for me, it was the ability to hold on to that creative, intellectual, questing part, because that was the part of me that my father's action attempted to destroy.
Yes. I I mean, it's so fitting that it was the spider medicine that helped you with this, because of course spiders are very associated with the female and the feminine, and the mother of the world, weaving the fates, and that, like you say, that kind of part of the way, like when you talk about the masculine versus the feminine, and of course a lot of these kind of opposites or so-called polarities, oppositions, tend to be in the largest society. One is valued and one is denigrated. And like you're saying with the spiders, it becomes a repository for all this kind of spooky, scary stuff that we don't
Right.
want to confront. But as you're saying, as souls, as spiritual seekers, we need to be able to integrate these parts. I don't know. I liked that in Mysterious Beauty, you were doing some analysis of the ecology in the
Mm-hmm.
area. And I studied anthropology in college, and a certain amount of ecology as well, because I was studying domestication in like Mesoamerica and stuff. And you can see in those type of situations where you can have think, oh well, you have the human beings here and whatever our main crop is, and that's all that's important and blah blah blah, but you don't realize that there's nematodes or fungi that need to be present in the ecology in order to support these various processes that are maybe hidden to us, but that's what's making it possible for like trees to grow, so we can have tree products, and also, by the way, oxygen. So
Well, and companionship. They are friends. They are
oh yeah,
friends.
trees are. I mean, I don't get me started on my conversations with trees. Oh God, that sounds very Northern Californian, if you will. But I find it so. As you're saying, it's like you have to have, as a person going through life and confronting these aspects of you know sex and individuation and raising a family, career, all these things as you go through life. Um, like you say, sometimes you'll have these experiences or a situation will be such that you can only cope with so much at one time.
Oh,
But
well, yeah.
then there is the opportunity, as you say later on, hopefully, to be able to create a situation where you can bring more of this on board. Um, and my teacher, Leslie Temple Thurston, she talks a lot about the marriage of spirit
Mm-hmm.
and how, as you're moving forward, because I think it's really important that you brought up this trauma. Now, I have never been raped. When I was a young girl, though, I had a lot of attention from grown men. I had like about half a dozen times where I was walking around like being 8 years old or 12 years old, 13 years old, grown men in their cars following me, bigger than me, trying to get me to get in the car. Grown men holding me down on top of me, and me
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
managing to vibe my way out of it. And I think a lot of men, especially some women too, it's like not wanting to confront the fact that a lot of the times with women, especially young girls, like young boys too, but that's kind of your first initiation into the whole world of sexuality can be these very traumatic experiences, which have nothing to do with, as you say, love, right?
Or sex, honestly.
Yes, no, I would agree. I would say that sex involves a exchange and transformation and communication between the two parties, and someone just, as you say, just imposing their will on someone else is not. That's not any communication. That's not an exchange. It's just pure. I don't know. It's just aggression, and I mean, to me, that would be evil, obviously.
It's violence. It's violence.
Exactly. So luckily for me, when we were young, our parents were a lot more indulgent. They give us our privacy, they joke about it and stuff. So there wasn't that kind of sexually repressive or overly sexual atmosphere, which, I'm very grateful for. But in regards to trauma and, this kind of sexually based aggression coming at you when you're very young and unprepared for it, I have found over the years that, I'll do a particular practice of taking that on board and giving it back at the higher level. If someone's kind of like, hey, come on, I'll approach it as if, is that like, let's say I'm a spiritual friend and you're approaching me, and I'll give it back to you in that way, which, I mean, it sounds manipulative. If you do it open-heartedly, like you say, then I think that it's not. It helps on the practical level. I found it helps diffuse a lot of situations. Also, I mean, it's not fair. It's not right? But we are here, and so we're in this world, and there is this stuff that's around, and we have an opportunity to try and kind of integrate and clear these things, or to just continue to react and be fear-based, which sometimes, that's what you have to do. Right. But there is this opportunity, hopefully, as you go forward, to be able to do this. The other thing that I wanted to bring up as far as like sex and the erotic, which is something I like to try and emphasize, if you're trying, I don't want to say, a lot of what happens, I find in these type of practices with other people, even, just like meditating with other people or praying with other people, that type of thing, you end up working with each other's bullshit, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it'll end up, if you have a good working relationship with a person, you may be able to transform some of their, be in a place where you can transform some of their material more easily. You have more facility with that, and they may be able to do the same with you. But it comes down to what you talk about love. I think you have to have a true selflessness and a true love for the other person, so that, because I've had this happen. I've had when you get involved with someone and they're, more adept, or they've been practicing for a while or whatever, and so you tend to get more energetic stuff flying around and issues coming up. And it's, I was with this one person, and they had definite issues, similar to your own, very secretly. This person, actually, their father, they had, two sisters, this one and her mom, and dad was a merchant marine. And I guess, he would spend long time away from the family, but he was always involved and in touch and everything. So when she was I think in her early 20s, her dad ended up in the hospital with a heart attack, and his other wife and other family showed up as well, that they hadn't known about, right?
Yeah.
So she had some issues. So when we were together, of course, if you have that type of connection, it's going to bring all this stuff up, and it ended up kind of blowing up and backfiring. So I always counsel people, if you're because I don't know, you see a lot of these articles about like sex magic or sex mysticism, and it's like, oh, just, blah, 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 do all this stuff. It's like, well, hopefully, you're just by yourself or whatever, and it doesn't really get going, so you don't. But if you, have real chemistry with someone, or for whatever reason you manage to kind of pull it off, it's going to bring up all this, trauma, your unresolved shadow, all these type of things, so that you can integrate it. But like you said, you need to have a good support system to be able to hold it together and actually integrate it, instead of just kind of like freaking yourself out. So
Yeah, well, I will say, I mean, I think one of the things that happened, and this is where I can start talking about my own practice a little bit. I think one of the things that happened as a result of what occurred when, when I was small, is that I like most people that this happens to, although I have noticed that you don't have to have this particular trauma to be confused about this in our society, because I think we're confused about this.
yep.
I became very confused about love and sex. I didn't even know what sex was. I mean, I didn't associate what my father was doing with. I had no frame of reference for it, so I didn't know that that was sex. And in fact, later on, I actually asked my mom, what sex was and where babies came from, because that didn't connect
Yes.
with that, because that was a separate act of violence, and there was nothing that connected with that anything else. But as a result of that break in trust, essentially, and I couldn't really go to my mother with this, because my mother was suffering from postpartum depression, and she was absent emotionally a lot of the time. And it's not like my father did this sort of thing repetitively. He didn't. There were some things that happened afterwards, but on some level, because he was so religious, he knew that he'd screwed up.
Yeah.
And so he actually used his religion even more vigorously to try to get himself to stop. So it's not like I was like some people constantly having to deal with this from him. But the problem with him was that he transformed all of that into anger. And
Yes.
so he didn't sexually assault me again, but he did beat me physically. I mean, we're talking like with fists and objects, and and at weird intervals, so that you never knew exactly when he was going to do it. So I had nobody or no place for whom and to whom I could, as the Jewish scriptures put it, to yield my love. I didn't trust his God, because his God made him, and look at that.
Yep. Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
like smart enough to figure all of that out.
Yeah.
Even though
Yeah.
emotionally it was devastating, because there was no place to go. So I ended up, one of the things that I would do is, and this of course is an immature response, but it was the best response I had, was that I would develop these really intense friendships with
Mhm.
usually young girls,
Mhm.
and they would have sort of an erotic tinge, even though
Mhm.
that I didn't associate it with sexuality, because I was too young. And the only reason I did that was because I had to have someone with whom to share something close with, even if I couldn't really talk to them about it. It was like all of the love that I had, because I think people feel love differently, but as a child, I now know I had big fat love. I just, you know, and I had big fat love for everybody and everything,
Yay.
and I didn't have any place to put it. And so I would just sort of give it to, these people, or I gave it to animals. That was the other thing I gave it to, or I gave it to trees. And that was my beginning of my relationship with nature, which I think is a perfectly legitimate thing to give fat love to,
Oh,
because
yes.
it gives fat love back,
Exactly.
and animals do. Animals
Yes.
definitely give fat love back,
Yes.
and they completely get fat love. That's what I call it. What I mean by fat love is when it's like this. So, I mean, I've gone through many, like, spiritual. I don't want to go into all my spiritual, all my stages in spiritual growth, but
Oh.
basically, what finally changed for me,
Mhm.
what began the change, was when I was introduced to Sufism, because Sufism has a fundamentally different way of understanding the erotic. than some other traditions. I mean, in the way that it's practiced. Because, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Kundalini and, you know, the pulling up of the energy and all of that. In Sufism, you don't pull up the energy. You open the energy from the chest, from the middle.
That is so fun. That is so interesting because that was the maneuver that I was taught during my near-death experience. It's just down the center, just fucking open the barn doors and let it all come out,
Well,
you know?
well, and the argument. There's actually a theory to this, and the theory is that, and this is part of the reason why. In fact, for a long time, I couldn't understand what my teacher meant when he said that you can use Sufism with almost any other spiritual practice except Kundalini. And I didn't understand that. And the reason is because for Sufis, the origin of everything, including the body, is from the middle out, not from the bottom up. Now, once you open from the middle, then the other centers open.
Yes.
Okay. But it's from the middle out, and because that's the heart, that's the kalb, and kalb represents both the physical heart, but it also represents the heart of life, and so if you start, and this is actually similar to what shamans do, and I didn't know this at the time until I was introduced to this, but you pull in and release everything from the center. And when I started doing that, and I started doing these practices, I started doing these practices probably 25 years ago. But the very first time I started with these practices, you might be familiar with the diamond approach. I don't know if you've heard. You can look it up. It's a particular kind of therapeutic modality that is a combination of Gestalt therapy, cognitive Gestalt therapy, Buddhism, and Sufism that have been combined into a practice. I still find it a little intellectual, but myself, but and this is part of the reason why, even though I'm brainy, this is part of the reason why I'm a Sufi and not a Buddhist, because if I do Buddhism too much, then I go right into my intellectual defense mechanism, which is and that's not useful for me. It's useful for some people, but not for me. So, but the first time I was ever exposed to this practice, which is based in Sufism, I had the most extraordinary telepathic experiences with the teacher that I'd ever had in my life. It was at the point where I was sitting in front of her. We're in a group. We're sitting in front of her, and I'd get a thought, and I would get a thought, and it'd be the next thing she'd do. And I'd get the next thing she'd say. And then I'd raise my hand and she'd respond. It was just bizarre. It was just completely bizarre. And part of the other reason why Sufism really resonated with me is because it was the first time in doing Sufi dancing and whirling and that kind of stuff that I'd ever experienced the erotic with both sexes and all genders. In a group setting where sex did not become involved.
Yeah.
Where all of that energy, and it was clearly erotic because it would stimulate different things, but it would be pulled up, and it would, like, all together in a group, we would take that energy and we would just move it up and to a higher level, and it would just sort of like, it doesn't negate anything. What it does is it actually affirms your existence as a physical being in this place.
Exactly. Yes.
And it affirms the importance of your physicality and your spirituality. And it was because of that finally all that sex stuff started to change and to heal. But it's taken 25 years. It's taken a long time because, as you say, all the bullshit coming up. In Sufism, we call that bullshit. It has a name.
Term.
It has bullshit. A name. It's called the Nafs.
The Nafs.
And the Nafs, Nafs. And what the Nafs are, the Nafs are many things, but one of the things that the Nafs are is they are the components of your ego
Mhm.
that have created your personality. You're born with some of them because you have to be, because you're born into a physical self. They're the components of your personality and those things that you've developed as defense mechanisms, and those things, so all of these things together, and those things that have helped to construct your physical body. And also that then what happens is your ego gets attached to your physical body and to the sensations of your physical body, and it tries to convince you, it uses the body to convince you that it's the only reality.
Yeah. Mm.
It tries to become little king. And the truth is that we have allowed the ego to do this, even though what we do is we take the ego and we all say, you must become an individual, you must do this. And then we sort of make these little egos, and then we just leave them off on their own for them to try to figure out what the hell's going on all by themselves without support. And no wonder they become little tyrants, because
Yes.
they're terrified, and they know that they don't really exist by themselves. They know this. I mean, does,
Yeah.
does this sound like someone we know in the White House? Anyway, I mean, it's not surprising to me at all that that person is
Sadly.
there, because
Yes.
he is like the expression of like our national ego, you know. But anyway, but the Nafs are not considered enemies. The Nafs are considered those things that teach us, and as they teach us, and we learn, they either are integrated and transformed into something, or they're discarded. They just sort of unravel and go away. you know
I I find this has been an issue for me recently, but something I've been noticing a lot in the I've always been interested in flying saucers since I was little, and of course now with the with the TTSA thing, and there's a lot of that Blink. I haven't really been following it. That Blink 182 guy, and they're trying to get more of the like physical scientific type evidence going and stuff. And there are people who have been studying some of the more subtle or sociological or mythical aspects of the phenomenon, who are, I'll just say it, they're very triggered by these people having a nuts and bolts attitude.
right.
And so there tends to be a lot of this fighting in between. And to me, I agree with you. I mean, the spiritual is very important, but as you're saying, the erotic is what grounds us in the physical and in the manifest world. That's our relationship to all that is quote unquote outside of us. And first of all, I think that different people, like you're saying, have different relationships. Some people are going to be very much more kind of physically grounded. Some people are going to be more mystically inclined. But if you have something like the UFO phenomenon, I mean, it takes place on all these various levels.
It's everything. It's like
It's
God.
everything. It's
Ah.
like, yeah, it's
Like
like human
God.
beings, right? You
That
have the
too.
physical body, you have the emotional resonance, you have the intellectual ideas, you have the art, you have all these things together. So we need all these various approaches to be able to come together to get some type of a wider understanding or a kind of integration as a group. I was talking with actually Greg Newkirk. They've had this Hellier documentary that they've been
Oh,
doing.
yes, yes.
Yes.
Yes,
So he
I've
keeps,
actually been paying attention to that.
yeah. So I got on a big, long Twitter argument with a bunch of people, including him, because they keep, having this tagline, oh, it's like join the initiation or something like that. So he was having some thread that was kind of, like PR, kind of like getting people excited about it. And this other person came in and they kind of had, I didn't even think it was that terrible. It was just kind of like they weren't completely like super positive about it. They were just kind of like, how about XYZ? And Mr. Newkirk got, kind of upset about it. And I said, if you really think that this is going to be an initiation, right? And you're running this as an initiation, that's what you're saying, that this is what's going to happen. It's going to bring up everyone's shit. Not everyone is going to be like, oh, happy, sunshine, joy, 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 because people are going to be, that's the nature of initiation. That's the nature of this. that we're all taking these different approaches to things, and we need to have I mean, if someone is being an asshole, they're acting in bad faith, they're abusing people, that's one thing. But if they're just taking their own path to a subject that they, feel is important to them, they want to go file a bunch of FOIA documents or whatever, I say more power to them, because I don't know what they're going to find out. I don't have the time and energy to do it.
Right. Well, and see, to me, and this is where I need to plug other things too.
Uh-huh.
This is where what, let me put it this way. What is useful and wonderful about the paranormal, number one, is just the word itself, because it implies that there is such a thing. It's one of our neologisms that we do in English. But what's lovely about the paranormal is that the paranormal is where all of these things meet. And but if a person is familiar with traditional beliefs, like I think, really honestly, my healing, other than Sufism 2 years ago, is because of the work that I've been doing with Native teachers, because this is something that's really, really hard for even people who are sympathetic to Native spirituality to get. Mm-hmm. And the only way I was able to get this at all was by returning to the way I was as a child, is remembering how I was as a child, that I could do this as a child. And what this is let me just give you an example. In the Algonquin traditions that I've been learning, mm-hmm. Grandfather Eagle lifts our blessings and praises to the heavens. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, Grandfather Eagle is a symbol, but Grandfather Eagle is also every eagle that you see.
It is. Yes.
Every eagle that you see. Now, if you were to grab that eagle and say, Grandfather Eagle, that eagle would try to take your head off, because that's a particular eagle, But but the point is that there is not this division. The division, there's this quantum understanding that the division that we make in the Western world between the physical manifestation of something and its spiritual reality, that there's really no division there. It's just a temporary momentary expression of something that's physical, that is giving us a reminder, a clue, reminding us of relationship. That's why that's why Native names for like humans and animals and plants are like this long, and that's because they're actually describing a relationship.
Yes.
It's a verb. So it's actually describing a complicated relationship, and talking about not only its spiritual underpinnings and its relatedness to things, but also then how it will manifest to you. That's a way at least Algonquin languages work. I would assume that most other Northern Native languages work similarly. I mean, Old Celtic was very similar to this. Mm-hmm. So it's not like Indo-European is devoid of these realities. It's just that we have forgotten what those things are. But I mean, for example, the original meaning of the term God mm-hmm. in Old Gothic literally means that which stands there and speaks. I mean, if we thought about that, it's like, oh, that means that's everywhere. Okay. Exactly. And so from the Shawnee perspective, everything that you see, whether it's a book or an animal, most specifically an animal or a plant or another person, all of these are potential what are called tipwiwe, or faith bearers, witnesses to the reality, not that's away from us, but that we're walking through it, it's around us all the time. There isn't any outer space. We are in space. It's around us, through us. We are just temporarily going, wham! Oh, yeah. Stephanie, like at every moment, yes. But there are natives who still live this way, who still get this, and if we were to understand this, it changes your spiritual practice, your magic practice. It changes everything you thought you knew about what you know. And then you don't have the argument about whether something is physical or symbolic. It's like, it's all of the above. Pick one. It's like a particle or a wave. Sometimes it's physical. Sometimes it's spiritual. Sometimes it's Bigfoot leaving a footprint. Sometimes it's Bigfoot going poof and turning into a ball of light and flying away. It's like, it's whatever it is. So there's that. And then I have to put this plug in. If you and others have not read Jane Roberts, you need to read Jane Roberts. It's all in here. Let me tell you, Jane Roberts in the 1960s, Seth was talking about contacting aliens. He was talking about who Bigfoot was. He was talking about all this stuff before anybody was talking about it, and providing a framework whereby you can understand this. And in fact, for this conversation, I prepped, because I will recommend this to you personally, the book, The Nature of the Psyche, because it's all about the erotic and sex.
Well, it's funny
and language.
Because I have been on this kick, I don't know, like the past probably year and a half or so of really getting into Psyche's story, because it's very similar to a lot of these accounts of alien abduction and contact with aliens, right? I mean, she goes on top of a hill and she's whisked away into the sky. And then there's this whole bedroom visitation thing where it's like super sexy, right? Yeah, she goes to this trip. And it kills me too, because I've been, Whitley Strieber has been speaking recently. I guess he was just on Radio Mysterioso a couple of times. He was on New Thinking Aloud with this book he did with Jeffrey Kripal, talking about his erotic connection with that lady on the front of communion, and also his relationship with his wife now that she has died. And it's fascinating because, of course, the whole idea of these mantis people that, have this super erotic connection with people, which is interesting because, of course, Psyche's symbol is butterfly wings, right? She's a butterfly. So it's this whole idea of the transformation and all this type of stuff. So that's fun that you have recommended that, because I've been on this big Psyche kick. And recently I was really interested, because you're talking about nature, the whole, there's the whole scene from her mythology of when they've been caught out, her and her boyfriend. No one's happy about it. She's trying to go through all these trials, and Cupid just like has the vapors. Plus, I think she's knocked up on top of all of it.
The Greeks had some serious issues, I tell you. They were just so funny.
But anyway, there's the whole scene of her being comforted by Pan, right? And to me, this is just so beautiful, because it's, the soul, the broken heart, is healed and comforted in nature, of course. So I've been appreciating that. There's some different statues and stuff that I've seen that are kind of fun, but I like that scene, because even though you have like this whole weird thing of like the whole kind of alien contact, erotic contact with that, you also have this, again, going back to the heart and nature, as being essential to this. And I also really like Psyche's story, because in the end of it all, I mean, it's not like, who's the guy, Prometheus or whatever, it's like, fuck you, you fuck with the gods, we're fucking with you, you're getting your liver eaten out, blah, blah, blah.
Well, it's Prometheus going to get his liver eaten out.
Yeah, by an eagle. Instead, it's kind of like, okay, you fucked with the gods. Aphrodite is the last person I would ever want to fuck with too. Man, she just seems like a real hard ass.
Yeah.
But in the end, it's kind of like, okay, everyone just has to get along. We're going to have a new thing happening here. And that's the power of the erotic. It's like, okay, we have to learn how to get along and create a new reality. Because, of course, part of the thing is that she's pregnant and there's this child, and just, if we can't manage to be heartfelt and put our own selfish desires aside for long enough, we will have no future, right?
Well, right. Well, and to me, this is the other component of love, which, I talk about, and when I'm talking about love, I'm not talking about romantic love. I know that you know this. I'm talking about the deeper love, the love that makes the alchemical marriage or wedding possible, the love that is the larger love, that is the creative source from which all things come. And
Exactly.
this is why I like to freak people out and say, well, this is part of the reason why I like the name Allah,
Hmm.
because the name Allah comes from the Arabic verb wahila,
Hmm.
which means a passionate love that will make you crazy.
Yeah.
And I mean, so that's the image of God in that. I mean, I know that it's misused by, people. I mean, if someone says Allahu Akbar and then chops somebody's heads off, I mean, what kind of a perversion is that?
Yeah.
It's a horrific misunderstanding of what that word means. And most Muslims now don't know any more about what Allah comes from than Westerners know where the term God, which I just told you, comes from,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So it's like, so we can't expect them to do any better, really. But for me, when I experience the core of reality, the universe or whatever, I experience this intensely creative, fiery kind of just freewheeling, um, loving, with a tendency towards the good, a
Hmm.
desire towards the good, a desire towards creativity and growth, a desire away from entropy. In fact, at the divine level, I don't think entropy exists. Entropy only exists in the
Yes.
realm that we are in. And then it's only in an apparent entropy. But in talking to that we all have to live together, the other component of that is this much maligned and horrific word, which I had to have redefined for me by Sufism, which is the term forgiveness.
Yes.
Because what forgiveness really means, if you go back to the root of the word, is that it doesn't mean that you just forget everything that's happened, because you can't do that anyway. What it means is that you are able to take whatever has occurred, good or bad, and put it into a larger context, reframe it so that there is more space for something else to develop.
No, that's a beautiful way of putting it. I was just discussing something similar with my mom because both sets of my grandparents come from the foothills south of Yosemite here in California, which is an incredibly gorgeous uh, part of the world. But there's also, this huge trauma, over like 100 years ago. They were all very poor, had some very trying circumstances. And my it's kind of inspirational to me. My dad's mom lived till she was 103. She died a few years ago, Gladys. And when I was young, she was very shy and very reserved, and it was very difficult to get close to her. But then when she started to get like around 80, 85, which, I mean, you would never expect someone at that age to change so much, but she really started to soften and open up, and was able to really get that feeling of love with her and everything. But just learning some of the things that she went through, her folks came over from Australia to Fresno, that area, they sent over for her two sisters, and they both, the ship that they were on sank, and they both drowned.
Oh my God.
And then she had a brother who I guess was, like good looking and fun and all that type of stuff. And he was, I think, in his early 20s. He went to a dance one night, and he didn't come home until later that morning. His horse came dragging his dead body.
Oh my God.
Yeah, her husband, my dad's dad, let's see, how do I put this? My great grandfather, his dad, was 17 years old and working, in his own father had a store like in the kind of Wild West gold country foothills.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this was probably in the like the 1880s, 1890s, something like that. Anyway, so my great grandfather was 17 years old working in the back of the store. His father was in the front. A man came in, robbed his father, and killed him while he was in the back.
Yeah.
And so it's just these, and then it comes down to, my he ended up, my great-grandfather, having, I think he had some mental illness problems anyway, but he ended up, I'd always heard these stories about how my grandfather had delivered his two younger brothers from his mom. And my one great uncle, Bob, he was a preemie. They had like a wood stove, and they had like took a drawer and put him on the stove to keep him warm because he was so small. And I was kind of wondering, like, why is my grandfather being like a teenager and delivering his brothers? Is because his own father was in mental institutions off and on because of this whole trauma of, his father's murder. So when you talk about like seeing the larger context, your parents will do things, and I didn't have anything that really horrible from my family, but it when I found out these type of things, it's like, it really helps you see, they were doing the best that they could, but holy shit,
No, right. Well, and life, the part of the reason why I like the Seth material is that it kind of puts some of this stuff into context. And one of the things that's explained in the material as a whole, I mean, it's not like in any one place, but it's talked about in different places. And actually, there are hints of this in other work. Like if you're familiar with the book that's called the Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. There are certain that guy. His theory sort of hints at this. It's just that Seth talks about it in a little bit of different ways, and the way he explains it. And actually, Sufism has almost an identical story from a completely different place. But the idea basically is that the type of consciousness that human beings have, the highly focused form of consciousness, was in a sense a kind of experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular reality, because there are endless realities, right? In this particular version that we're in
right now,
that we're focused in, the ego has become sort of bound up. We're sort of, he doesn't say egomaniacs. He says we're ego bound.
Mm-hmm.
And we've actually trapped the ego. The ego itself has become trapped in its own machinations, essentially. And we see that in the world. But the world was never intended originally when this idea came about, or this experiment came about. It was never intended to be as painful as it is. And part of the reason why it's so painful is because of our focus.
Yeah.
And in our society, pain also has become an index of truth. We don't deny people who are in pain that they are telling the truth. What we do is, if we want to diss them, we deny that they're in pain.
Yes. Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So pain is like the index of truth. And if you think about that, that's really kind of messed up. But that is where our society, that's where our ego-bound society has gone. And the only way to get out of that is to step back from it. I mean, that's the only way you could, and just really not participate in what Sethis call the OLC, the official line of consciousness. Really not participate, or participate as little as possible. So don't do things, because what ends up happening in our society is that because we privilege pain and sensation as the element of truth, everything we do in our society is built upon generating pleasure or pain, pleasure or pain, pleasure or pain. And it's just a distraction. It's not really, I mean, and on another level, we know it's not real. We know it's not real. But because when I talk to my students, just regular students in a classroom, I'll come in and I'll say weird things like, okay, so what kind of dreams did you have last night? And they just kind of look at you like, what? What? And we'll talk about the dreams. Oh, I had this dream, I'll tell them a dream that I had, and they'll just be like, why is she talking about dreams? It's like,
I had a wild dream recently. I had an erotic encounter with like a giant squid.
Well, that sounds positively Lovecraftian.
It was
or had you seen one of those wild Japanese tentacle porn movies?
But it was really nice because it, like at a certain point I was just kind of you know how they have like the body and then the tentacles come off, and it was like kind of being like embraced in the tentacles and like floating in the water. It was just kind of like, I think it was probably like if you're like a cat or a dog and just like having a person with a nice big lap just like kind of holding you
Oh, that
that
sounds
way.
actually very, that actually reminds me, it does remind me of a 19th century Japanese tentacle porn scroll.
Oh yeah.
There's this great one of a big octopus doing oral sex on a woman who's just being cuddled in his arms, its arms. I don't know if it's a he or she actually. I mean,
Yeah, that's
octopuses.
I think it's
I can't tell the difference myself. Whether they're male or female. I mean, I guess the male octopuses have like a little penis-like object on one of their tentacles, and but I'm not gonna like, I'm not gonna like, it's not a tentacle, it's an arm. They have arms. It's squids who have tentacles. Okay, I have to remember that. But it's not like I'm going to like grab one of their arms and say, okay, which one is your penis?
that's
Hello.
the thing. I was like, because like a dog or something, you figure you kind of know, you just let it go on your leg, and then, but then you have something. Some of these other creatures, you're like, how would you even approach?
Well, it's no different. Well, it's like we have Star Trek, so it's like, there's no difference between it and extraterrestrials, right?
With that Galaxy Quest. Whenever the guy starts making out with that woman, and she's getting so turned on, she just like can't help starting her tentacles.
Yeah, your tentacles.
That's so funny.
Yeah, that is
She's like,
hilarious.
oh.
Yeah, that is so fucking. Oh, sorry. I can say fuck. It doesn't matter. I'm used to being on Church of Mavis where we
I
can't say
know,
fuck.
I know, you can't have a swear. But
So
yeah,
you can.
well, I always crack up at octopuses because, well, but one of the things that was I noticed during this whole squid encounter was that they have those real big eyes looking at you. I was thinking it's kind of like if you were an exhibitionist, this would be wonderful. But I always think about, because a lot of these ones they show, they have like the really big octopuses, or like the Cthulhu is like huge. And we have a lot of octopuses here on the Pacific coast. And I always think about someone like, oh, I'm going to encounter this octopus in this kind of spiritual, erotic way or something. But the thing is that they have these huge presences and personalities, but they're only about this big.
Yeah.
You just think you're there, and it's like this little octopus coming up to you, like.
Well, so here's your foot, right? And it
Really?
comes up and it goes. Yeah. Well, what's funny. What's funny to me is that, and this actually is connected to paranormal stuff too, because this is the way paranormal stuff is for me. Because I know a lot of people, like the Bigfoot people and I say Bigfoot people like they're not my people. The folks who go out and look for Bigfoot, the folks who go out and look for UFOs, the folks who go out and look for ghosts. They spend a lot of their time questing.
Yes.
And then occasionally they'll have experiences. But for me, the paranormal, just like the erotic, it always has its own timetable. So
Yes.
it's when I don't expect it that it suddenly pops up and goes, hello, and there it is. And so I've sort of learned in my own practice just to kind of go from day to day, expecting that things will happen, but I don't know exactly when. And I don't know exactly where or what, because it's oftentimes in situations or with people that I don't expect at all. Or with animals, animals are just amazing. We have really deprived ourselves.
Yes.
They are amazing, amazing beings, and they have so much to teach us about just regular life, just regular life, and
Yeah.
and what I like about them is, they're erotic, but they're not
Hmm.
necessarily sexual. Sometimes they are, but
Hmm.
there's no like grand narrative attached to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not like we're like, oh, I had this experience. What does it mean? Oh, does this mean I'm gay? Does this mean I'm straight? What does this mean? I mean, it's like, I don't know. It's just shut up. Just let it be what it is. I wanted to read you something.
Okay.
This is from Seth, but and he's talking deeply about sex, actually. He says,
Hmm.
but any deep exploration of the self will lead you into areas that will confound conventional beliefs about sexuality. You will discover an identity, a psychological and psychic identity that is, in your terms, male and female, one in which those abilities of each so-called sex are magnified, released, and expressed. They may not be so released in normal life, but you will meet the greater dimensions of your own reality, and at least in the dream state, catch a glimpse of the self that transcends a one-sex orientation. And by that he means, that what's attached to gender and all the masculine, feminine stuff that we're talking about it. Such an encounter with the psyche, see, he uses the word psyche, is often met by great artists or writers or by mystics. This kind of realization is necessary if you are to ever transcend the framework of seeming opposites in which your world is involved.
I completely agree. I've been reading this book by Montauk Chia about Taoist sex magic.
Right.
And
also comes a lot from here and a lot from here. I don't know if you can see, it's my gut right here.
Yeah. But he has this one phrase, which if I was truly prepared, I would have written down so I could read to you. But he's talking about how, and this gets back to the whole seeming opposites that we do. Like, the spiritual is higher than the material, and denigrating one in favor of the other. And he's talking about, for example, many teachers coming from the East where they were happily celibate, and then come over to the West, and suddenly, oh, well, it turns out maybe you hadn't actually integrated that part of yourself, and so you're getting caught up in all this drama and acting out sexually, manipulating other people or being abusive. But he just talks about, if you can build a beautiful roof, but if you don't have a solid foundation, right? Mm-hmm. And so I really like that Seth quote, because I don't think that it necessarily has to be through, ritual sex magic with all the, physically having sex with some other person with, all the stuff you see, and it all looks very aesthetic and very exciting. But
let's try this position. Let's try this position.
Oh gosh, never did have perfect winged eyeliner or whatever.
Well, some of those positions, I'm sorry, I just can't do because my leg doesn't go over there. But
Oh, anyway, but you have to. It has to do, like you said, with the connection with the erotic, that divine flow through you, moving out towards the manifest world. I think it could happen. My brother, I've been thinking about him a lot recently. Poor thing. He is a fly fishing guide up in Redding on the Sacramento River. And my dad and I went with him for a day on the river beginning of October. And it's just, of course, it's like completely intoxicating sensually. You have this beautiful clear river flowing, and it has, the quiet parts and the real riffly parts and more turbulent. And he does this like a drift boat. So it has a way where it just kind of spins lazily along. Mm-hmm. And of course, you're fishing for trout, you're fishing for salmon, and he's been doing this for years now. And, so he'll row you down and, coach you on catching these fish and everything. And he's real strict about catch and release. He's like, okay, you see this fish? Okay, it's going back in the water.
Right.
But just the relationship with this river and knowing the headwaters that feed down into the whole watershed, the water quality, what particular trout are in there, which are wild, which have been farmed, where were they planted from, all the different type of salmon, what's their life cycle. When you look at this particular hen, where is she going to be on the river in relationship to these particular rocks, knowing how to navigate through the river. I mean, it's like this incredible relationship of knowing something that's so much bigger than you and outside of you that you're also connected to. And I think that gets to this, erotic connection that can help you reconcile yourself to the manifest world, which to me,
Because the manifest world isn't separate from the spiritual world; it's within the spiritual world. The spiritual
Exactly. They're
world,
enmeshed.
it's an expression of the spiritual world.
Yes, yes.
And the spiritual world is working out, it's working out various ways of doing that. I mean, regardless of whether you believe there are many worlds or not. I mean, I believe that there are, but even if you don't believe that, because you're here and that's where you're focused, there's, still, this is a place in which, and this is, again, this is Seth saying this, this is where that redemption occurs. And because what redemption means is just a way of understanding the relationship, the balance between where you come from, where you are, and where you're going. Because that's how we experience things, is through time, even though there is no time, ultimately.
Yes.
Time is the mechanism whereby we learn that lesson of expression. We learn that because that's why we're here. We're here to creatively express. That's why creativity is so much important part of this. I think part of it, and I will just, since we've talked about Greek stuff, I'll talk about Plato a little bit here. And I didn't learn this until, I went to school and got taught some of the stuff in Greek. But when Plato, in his original, when he's talking about the forms, moving from the world of appearances to the world of forms, or his famous cave metaphor that he uses to describe that, the word that he uses for the impulse of the soul that is going towards the realm of the real or the realm of the ideal, the impulse of the soul or the psyche is eros. He uses the word eros. And of course, that's where we get the term erotic. Now, for the Greeks, eros was a slightly different thing than erotic has become for us. But it had that sort of sexual tinge and that he really clearly understood it as a much more mobile and creative thing than I think we've given him credit for. And the only reason I know this is because one of the people who taught me this knew Greek. And talked about, how is this word actually used in the Greek? How did the Greeks understand this? And what's happened is that when we readopted all of that stuff back into our canon, during the Renaissance, the Neoplatonic binge that we went on, where we jettisoned Aristotle and said, "Pooh" to Thomas Aquinas, and and jettisoned all that, the idea, it was Descartes and his ilk that did this. Plato, we forgot that it was eros, and we understood that it was just the mind. It was just the rational capacity, and it isn't just the rational capacity. It's the capacity of the whole person. The eros encompassed the whole center of a person. And it was understood to be a creative love impulse towards a beloved. Yes. And when I found that out, I was like, "Oh, I've been learning Plato wrong for years." Oh God, and it's affected Christianity, and it's affected the sciences, and it's affected our economic systems. Yes. So it's no wonder that we're just like screwed up. We're just screwed up. But the truth is that at any moment, any one of us can get unscrewed up, because it's not, I mean, I've gone through the 80s and 90s. I went through the whole plethora of things. I went through Kabbalah. I was in a magical lodge. I practiced under Tibetan Buddhist masters. I mean, literally, I have like maybe 7 empowerments. I have to remember to think of which ones they are. I did learn some useful techniques. I'm not going to say that. I mean, I've gone through, I actually got all of Kenneth Grant's books and went through the tunnels of Seth.
Oh my gosh.
And did all of that intense stuff, like on my own and sometimes with people. And one of the things that I learned is that none of this, I mean, if you want to do that stuff, that's fine. If anybody wants to do, I'm not trying to denigrate any of it. If anybody wants to do it, you want to read, I like Aleister Crowley. I think he's hilarious. It's like I read him and I'm like, oh, Alistair, you're such a butt, you know. Um, but I mean, I've read all, virtually all that was available to me. A lot of Kenneth Grant, a lot of the Temples of Set, all that stuff. And if a person wants to go that route, that's fine. I've also done the whole sort of Ancestral pagan thing. Um, it's so much so that when I first went back to college, I studiously took, courses in Icelandic and Old English, and
Oh,
German,
wow.
to just really kind of, when I get into something, I get into it,
Just a little bit, huh?
But one of the things that I learned was that none of it's that complicated. It's sort of like we do all this stuff. And if you want to do all that stuff, especially as a creative endeavor, just to kind of see, what comes out of you when you contact Psyche or you contact, one of these. I mean, I have made spiritual contacts in various of these modalities that have been useful to me that I maintain to the present day. But what I found is that all of those spiritual contacts are always there. They're always present. It's like to go through all of these machinations, and I'm sure this will insult someone, to go through all of these machinations is to be constantly creating keys for locks for doors that are always open. They're always open, and it's not like nobody's actually locked anything. It's all here. It's all here, in here, out here, all the time.
The thing is, like you're saying, I find that the issue is to be able to, and I'm looking at the clock, I'm thinking we should maybe wind up a little bit. This has been really fun. I mean, I could go on for another few hours, but I'll have to have you back. That, like you're saying, social conditioning, the knobs, all these things, they're getting you to focus in a certain direction, and they're kind of giving you a certain energetic structure. Right. And the thing is to be able to turn your attention to these more subtle or different types of energies and ideas and realms. So I think that those type of initiations and practices can be helpful for that. Yeah. But then at a certain point, it's just, hopefully you'll be able to gain a certain amount of adeptness and realize that it is simply a matter of turning your attention towards these other realities and consciousnesses. But it can, working against all the ego stuff and society and the day-to-day, it can take work. And I wouldn't, like you say, I wouldn't denigrate someone for pursuing it this way.
No. As long as you recognize that your own practice can itself become part of that ego construction.
That's the whole,
That's and how do I know when that's happening for me is when I lose the love. And I feel like I have to do this in order to do this and this and this. As soon as I'm just and I'm not, I actually am on the spectrum a little bit. So I do have a tendency to get very obsessive, as you can probably tell, to get really obsessive with certain practices. But what happens with me is that at some point I realize, oh, I've lost the love for this. And then I pull back, and what I do this actually, I take all my practices and I kind of stand in front of the universe and I go, I just throw them in the air. Say, okay, which ones do we want to fall? And I just, what I do is I leave, it's kind of vulnerable, but I leave myself very open. And what'll happen is over the next few days, it'll become very clear which of these practices need to stay, which need to go, which need to change. And I sort of let the internal, my connection to the divine make that decision rather than my ego.
No, that's great. And I think the whole posture as well. That's the other thing with a lot of these rituals. Sometimes it's like a very kind of, let's say, yang, kind of focused on activity and everything. And there needs to be that time where, like you say, you just kind of let go. You create that space for something new to happen.
Right. Well, and that can be very yang too. I mean, I don't think of this as yin and yang. I just think of it as, okay, and I think of myself as Wahaba, so I don't think of myself as C.S. Matthews. That's for people who need the academic
Yes.
credentials. I think of myself as my Sufi name, or one of my native names. I've got about 3 native names, but but to me it's like, oh, I'm getting all crowded again with stuff. Okay, what needs to go?
Yeah.
What needs to go? What am I too attached to? Because maybe a certain technique, maybe a certain practice worked really, really well for a long time. And so because it worked so well, I'm really, you get superstitious about it. You want to hold on to it. You want to say, oh, this always works. It's like, well, you can always go back to it. It's not like alcohol. It's like you can always go back to it. But just let it go and go do this now. Or go do this. And it's because the ego is always afraid that you're going to abandon it. And you have to teach it over time. I have to teach it, my ego, over time, that it will never be abandoned. That in fact, all of its desires and loves and goals will be met if it lets go and allows itself to be taught and allows itself to be transformed into the thing that it was supposed to be originally, because in our world, you're supposed to have an identity. You're supposed to be this. You're supposed to be this. Even Lady Gaga, who I happen to like a lot, even Lady Gaga says, "Be an individual." It's like, I don't know what that means. It's like, what? It's like I have no idea what it means to be a woman. Not a clue. When someone says, "You make me feel like a natural woman," I'm like, what? I don't even know what that means. It's like, what's an unnatural woman? What does that mean? I don't know. Now, obviously, I don't know what it means to be a man. I've thought about being a man. I can remember having been a man.
Yeah, that's a weird feeling, huh?
No, it actually is really interesting. It's like, oh, I remember having an erection. I don't have one now. Oh, okay.
What's the weirdest thing for me is I have a lot of chronic health issues and nerve damage and stuff like that. And I've had a couple of experiencing lives in the past that are not the life I'm living now. And the feeling of having a healthy, a strong body.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So you've experienced that in another place, in another person?
Yeah, I had one time we were up in the Angelo Nature Preserve. It's like a World Wildlife Fund preserve or something. Anyways, this huge preserve, and the rattlesnakes and bear sign, and we heard a mountain lion, which was exciting. I was so happy to get back to the car. Anyway, we were hiking, and at one point it was like I don't want to say like a homestead, and people had like a ranch, and it was strange as I was walking through this trail that used to be this road, and there was all these wildflowers blooming and stuff. It's like a high altitude up in Mendocino, really beautiful. And I had this strange feeling of experiencing what had been like a young woman who had been in their back, like in the 1880s or whatever, 1860s. And it was a pretty magical experience, but that was a lot of what I remembered, just the feeling of being like young and strong and healthy and having a different body. It was and moving through this landscape that I'd never been through before in a familiar way. So
yeah. I mean, I've had past life experiences. I've also had like parallel life experiences, which is really, really weird. Like I know that it's me in another reality, but just right next to me.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. It's but see, but what was, I guess this is part of the reason why I like the Seth material, is when I was a child, again, this gets me back. When I was a child, I began as a child because I taught to tell the story. When I was a child, I used to have these experiences naturally. I had these kinds of what I now recognize as out of body experiences. And I would automatically just go into trees. I would go into the tree and experience the world as a tree. And I went through this whole period of my life where I was experimenting, going into trees, going into animals, going into plants. I even tried to go into concrete, which is not very pleasant. You can, but it's not very pleasant. It's like, ooh, I don't want to be here. But I just naturally did stuff like that. I naturally just had these spontaneous experiences. In fact, I think that the UFO experience that we had, even though it was really scary and I didn't have any frame of reference for it at the time, I now understand that it was probably kind of a natural experience.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
and it just had a profound effect on me because I had already sort of been impacted by some other things. And I think it was, I also think it now, though, looking back on it, I think it was like a message. I think
Mm-hmm.
whatever was going on there was, because what's happened to me several times is that I've had the ability to address some of these beings that I've had experiences with. And I've said, like, why are you talking to me about this?
Yeah.
You know, like my grandmother, my father's mother, who I did not like and did not know very well, and still do not like. Just because I've seen her after death doesn't mean I like her any better.
Yeah.
She has appeared to me several times in dreams and
Mm-hmm.
has given me internal information about the family and about herself that later out has turned out to be true, even though no one will talk about it. And so at one point I asked her, why are you telling me this?
Mm-hmm.
And more often than not, I have gotten the answer, because you're paying attention, because you're the only one that's listening. You're the only one right here that's listening. And
Yeah.
this information needs to go somewhere. So you've got it. And I'm like, well, thanks, bud, but you've got it. So, at that point you become, what, in one of my native traditions is you become a truth bearer. You become somebody who has to carry this and has to
Mm-hmm.
figure out what to do with it and how to integrate it into your life. So we're interacting constantly, I think, with these other beings that I think we're all connected to them. I think most of the time other beings connect to us because we're connected to them in some way. But I know we're going to go on 2 hours here. So
I know. I was
it's
thinking, but yeah, I like that because it gets back to, looking at sex and the erotic. I mean, sex is what connects us to the ancestors, right? So part of integrating
yeah.
that whole is through this work. And also I don't want to say, the hidden parts of ourselves. Someone's trying to call me. I don't know. I've been getting a lot of spam phone calls recently. But the whole idea that sometimes I feel like as well, we have these kind of hidden parts of ourselves, like he's talking about the parallel lives that are going through these processes, and that it may take a while for that process to come into more conscious awareness. Right. But yeah, so it's interesting when you start to get this very different idea of, who you are, like you said, the soul. So anyway, okay, so let's wrap this up. We can always talk more later.
We can talk more later. Yes.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this and, sharing this. I've had a longstanding interest in this kind of aspect of life, and very much the whole mystical work of integration and knowledge of the divine. And so I just really appreciate you, being so frank and taking the time to speak with me about all this. So.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I hope to speak to you soon. We do need to have an all-female consortium thing at some point.
I know. I've been thinking about having some more of these conversations with just women. I am friends with a lot of guys in the paranormal and in real life, and from my own, it's kind of weird for me. From my own personal kind of energetic perspective, I'm like a super duper yin. So, I have to be like in, an NFL locker room after the game to feel like balanced out.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, I could take a lot of yang, a lot of that big, fat, macho energy. But I've been finding more that I'm interested in having some of these conversations that have to do with the feminine mysteries, the female side of things, just that part of the experience of the paranormal come to light. So thank you for speaking with me, and hopefully we'll have some more ladies come on here and talk about this. So
yes, and don't forget the nature of the psyche.
Thank you,
and get it.
And don't forget Wham's book, Mysterious Beauty. was it living in the paranormal in the
No,
Hudson
living with the paranormal,
in
living with
the paranormal in the Hudson Valley, and she's
cephalopods.
also interviewed on Shattered Reality, which is a podcast hosted by Fahrusha, a wonderful woman, and then also on the Alexx Cast. So I'm going to stop recording, and
Okay.
you hang on there.